Welcome to Asset TV Boutiques Connect with me, Zama Zulu Zulu. For today's topic, we are going to be discussing externalizing capital distributions from South African trusts. And to unpack this, I'm joined by Kirsten Kratz. She is the Regional Sales and Business Distribution Manager for the Western Cape at Currency Partners. Welcome, Kirsten. Lovely to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's just maybe put things into context before we delve into the topic, because I'm actually quite excited about this. So we are aware of the exchange controls that are in place for individuals. So we either have the single discretionary allowance of up to R1 million a year, or the foreign allowance that's up to 10 million rand a year. Does this allowance apply to trusts as well?
So no, it doesn't. I mean, in our space, in the wealth space in particular, we get this question a lot around how can a trust externalize funds offshore? And to put it in simple terms, in terms of the exchange control regulations, trusts and any legal entity for that matter does not have an individual allowance. So in terms of the mechanism, in order for a trust to externalize funds offshore, it has to distribute to a beneficiary, who in turn, as an individual, can externalize those funds.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad I asked the questions, and now we're all on the same page, even with our viewers. All right. So maybe then let's get into this topic of how does that payment actually work. So let's maybe use a couple of scenarios to maybe help our viewers also understand this better. So maybe as a start, what happens when a South African trust is distributing to a beneficiary that happens to be a South African tax resident, but it's somebody who actually lives abroad?
Okay, so I mean, we could use you as an example. If you decide you want to move to the UK and you happen to be the beneficiary of a trust, the trust will have to pay out to a local bank account, so an SA resident bank account that's in your name. And because you're a South African tax resident, you're obviously governed by exchange control regulation. So you would be required to externalize those funds using your annual allowances. So the single discretionary allowance you mentioned, the foreign investment allowance, and obviously depending on the value, if that distribution exceeds 1 million, you would also be required to get a tax clearance through SARS, also known as an approval for international transfers. So it's a pretty simple process. We would open up a local bank account in your name. The trust would distribute into that bank account, and then you'd be able to externalize and pay it to your offshore bank accounts from there.
Oh, all right. Okay. Now I think that makes sense. And you just used the example of if the distribution exceeds the 1 million rand. What if it exceeds the 10 million rand? I'm just saying, I wish.
So a special approval would be required. Right. That would be a Reserve Bank application.
Oh, all right.
For anything that exceeds your single discretion, your foreign investment allowance.
Okay, all right. No,
but again, I mean, it would go against your individual allowances as a South African tax resident. And in terms of that Reserve Bank application, there is actually no limit to how much you can externalize. So it could be anywhere from 10 million to, whatever amount.
Okay, great. And then another scenario. So let's say, again, let's use myself as an example. Okay. I wish I could, be one of these types of beneficiaries, but let's pretend for the purposes of this session. What if I am a beneficiary of a South African trust, but I have financially immigrated from South Africa? How would that work?
So in that instance, I mean, assuming you've got no intention to come back to South Africa, you've now gone through the formal tax migration process, and you're no longer considered a tax resident from a SARS perspective. In that instance, we would open up what's called an immigrant bank account for you. So the trust would be able to distribute into an immigrant bank account, and you would need to be able to prove that you have tax migrated. So along with the proof of your tax migration, you would also have a foreign passport and now a foreign address that would be required. And then now that you're no longer considered a South African tax resident, you would need a tax clearance through SARS. It's called an AIT, or International Approval of International Transfer.
Oh, okay. Now you mentioned, did you call it an immigration bank account?
An immigrant
bank account. Where is that based? Is it South Africa? Is the one that I would have?
It's a local bank account. Okay. It's just in terms of the status of that bank account, you're no longer a South African resident, so it's called an immigrant bank account. That would be opened through a local bank.
Oh, so there isn't an option to pay into a foreign-based
No.
bank account?
No, because then the trust would essentially be distributing directly offshore, which is not permissible under exchange control. So it first has to go into a local bank account that's in your name, and then, externalized through there. So from that local immigrant account paid to an offshore bank account in your name.
Oh, okay, so that would be the process. Okay, well, no, that's good to know. I'm glad I asked that and you've clarified. And then another scenario. So let's say I'm a beneficiary, but I have zero ties to South Africa, and nor have I ever lived in South Africa, but yet I am a beneficiary of a South African trust. How does that work?
Okay, so we would refer to that as a bona fide non-resident. So you've got absolutely no ties to South Africa, you've got no assets here, you've never worked here, you don't live here. So you're completely foreign from an exchange control perspective. Again, the trust would have to distribute into a local bank account, but that would be a non-resident bank account. So different from the immigrant bank account we just spoke about. But a non-resident bank account, a SARB approval would be required in this instance. So that's another caveat. And then in addition to, to support that application to the Reserve Bank to externalize those funds, the Reserve Bank would request various trust documents. It would also want to see a bank statement to understand the flow of funds from the trust to you. And then you would obviously also have to prove that you are a bona fide non-resident. So we'd request a foreign passport, which would state that you're not born in South Africa, and then obviously a proof of foreign address.
Oh, okay. You mentioned certain trust documents that would be required by SARS. Can you maybe just share some examples what documents those would be?
So it would look at the trust deed. It would look at the letter of authority from the master. The trust's financial statements, trust resolution, so various trust documents that essentially what the Reserve Bank wants to understand is this distribution is in line with the terms and conditions that have been outlined in the trust deed.
Oh, okay.
To you as a complete non-resident beneficiary.
Okay, all right, no, that makes sense. All right, and then the last example, what if there's an offshore trust that's the beneficiary of the South African trust?
So this is something that has been incredibly topical recently, I'd say for the past 6 months especially. So the South African Reserve Bank have published a directive. It's not published in the Reserve Bank manual, but a directive that has clarified that as a South African trust, you can actually nominate an offshore trust as a beneficiary. So because a South African trust can't externalize funds, directly offshore, it's another mechanism to, get that money offshore through the nomination of an offshore trust as a beneficiary. So in that instance, if we've got a foreign trust that's the beneficiary of a local trust, there would have to be a capital distribution, which would then be paid to a foreign trust. The reason this has been so topical is because there's been a lot of excitement and enthusiasm around this idea. But because it's, this mechanism is in place, but there are various conditions that you would need to meet to be able to sort of get this right. The first of which is a Reserve Bank approval. So there would need to be an application to the Reserve Bank, and that application can be somewhat onerous because there are various requirements that need to be met. So I won't go into the nitty-gritty of that because we might be here all day.
Or maybe just kind of give us a sense, not necessarily list everything, but just so that our viewers have an idea what would be required.
I think as a focus point, we can have a look at the minimum requirements to meet the condition for the application. So first things first is the offshore trust would need to be a named beneficiary of the South African trust, and the South African trust would need to be classified as a resident trust. Okay. So that's sort of the first requirement. The Reserve Bank will do a deep dive into the trust, the structure of the trust, and all related parties. So in terms of beneficiaries, trustees, if there's any related entities, the Reserve Bank will look at the tax compliance status of all of those individuals. Ooh. And it will also have a look at the ultimate beneficial ownership structure, and not only for the local trust, but also for that offshore trust. So in terms of the documentation that needs to be supported in this application, it's very lengthy. And then, of course, obviously the trust itself would need to be tax compliant. So obviously all the individuals that are related, as well as the entities, and then the trust itself would need to be tax compliant.
Sure, it actually does sound quite hectic when you actually start going into all of those minimum requirements. And those are just the minimum requirements, as you stated.
The minimum conditions to actually
okay.
even, you know, before you've sort of proceeded with the Reserve Bank application, I would say, you know, the biggest stress point is making sure that every single individual connected to that trust is tax compliant. You know, the application would be null and void in terms of proceeding with it if that's not the case.
Right, no, but thanks for sharing those insights, because I think, you know, for our viewers, I'm thinking specifically financial advisors, you know, who are dealing with high net individuals who are, you know, who do have trusts in place. And I mean, I think the reality for most people now, children tend to move abroad anyway. So if your beneficiaries are not living in South Africa anymore, it's important to be aware of some of these dynamics.
Absolutely.
Should you wish to make distributions paid.
Absolutely. And then I suppose the implication depending on the residency status. So oftentimes it's actually tricky to determine whether someone is a South African tax resident because, you know, perhaps one of the children have moved overseas, but they were born in South Africa, but they moved as a child, so they never got a tax number, etc. They still would actually be considered a South African tax resident because it would say born in South Africa on their passport. So, you know, there's various nuances, you know, to actually identifying. I think the first step is identifying the tax residency status of the beneficiary.
Okay, no, great. So maybe in closing, Kirsten, you clearly, as currency partners, know what you're doing in this space. Otherwise, you wouldn't be having a conversation with me. But for our viewers who are watching this and they are considering partnering with an entity that specializes in this field, why should they choose currency partners?
So, you know, I think it's important to look at what our clients care about. And I think what matters is obviously, you know, we help clients externalize funds or bring funds into South Africa. And, you know, there's the basic transaction and we can obviously assist with that. But I think what matters is the value add around that. So, you know, the expertise when it comes to exchange control and being able to navigate, you know, the nuances of the Reserve Bank and what is permissible, what is not permissible. And then as a company, you know, really holding service excellence is something that, you know, is important to our clients and important to us as well. So I'd say that, you know, differentiates us, our ability to offer services over and above the transaction of either externalizing and, you know, bringing funds into the country. You know, we can assist with the tax clearances, the Reserve Bank applications, tax migration. So we've got a holistic product offering. And then, of course, you know, the level of service that we endeavor to provide.
Yeah, and I suppose the service is always important. It really boils down to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights, particularly the nuances of this type of scenario where you've got distributions being paid offshore by the South African Trust. So thank you so much for your time, Kirsten. I'm sure we'll see you again. And to our viewers, thank you so much for your attention, and I really hope that you found this session informative. Until next time, goodbye.